Oh. Thank you. And now let me introduce our speakers. On the far end to my left, we have Matt Scroggs, assistant professor with term in the International Affairs Department at Lewis and Clark College, who has a focus on international relations, security, coercive diplomacy, Middle East politics, and American foreign policy. He holds a PhD in politics from University of Virginia, an MA from University of Chicago in international relations, and a BA from University of Washington, our dear friends up north in international studies and political science. And then right to my immediate left is Shawn Smallman, who has spoken for us many times. He is a professor of international studies and international and global studies at Portland State, and previously served as interim dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs. He has co-authored a textbook, An Introduction to International and Global Studies with Professor Kim Brown, which is currently entering its third?
It's about to go into fourth.
Its fourth edition, so you got to keep up. And has published on universal design and pedagogy in international and global studies. And both of our speakers teach introduction to international studies. And so when I saw the topic of America's global role, foreign policy's next chapter, I thought, why not have a little bit of a scrum and dive in to what is sitting on the table. If you read the article in the Great Decisions book, it is in essence kind of a liberal internationalism versus America First dialogue. But I think it's important to remember that we're looking at a lot of systems, a lot of assumptions, a lot of accepted wisdom that came into play, some of it earlier, but really came into play from the post-war period forward. And I was joking to both the speakers and with Derek this morning that if you got hired this week at a new company and they said, well, we're really excited you're here because we have this really, really, really landmark system called Windows 95 that we do everything with, you would probably, you would be aghast because you realize that while Windows 95 was a very, very landmark operating system at one point in time, it has had innumerable updates and refining. And when we look at the question of the international order and American foreign policy, it is an operating system that is always, or should always be undergoing an update on its operating system. That doesn't mean you should just yank the plug out from the wall and turn it off and on, as it seems to be doing. But I want to start with the conversation we had the other day when we were talking about this is, how are you teaching international relations when everything is changing or the rules are being changed mid-game? And I'd love to we can be free-flowing. This is not a formal panel. I know it looks like a tribunal. It is not. So I'd love to hear what is going on in how you're looking at things right now in the classroom.
Well, first, thank you all for being here today. Very excited to be here for WorldOregon for the first time. So for me, I think about this both in the context of teaching an introductory class and in the context of teaching U.S. foreign policy. Like, I treat them slightly differently in that with U.S. foreign policy, I have had to do a lot more thinking about significant revisions to the way that I think about teaching it. One of the examples that we were talking about the other day was, for the longest time, I've had a section in my class about the importance of soft power, the idea that we can use an attractiveness to try and get other states to do what it is that the U.S. wants. And that's one tool in the toolkit in addition to other things like war or coercion or sanctions. But with Trump 2.0, I've very seriously been thinking about just scrapping that entire section. Not because it's not important or not because other countries aren't able to do that. But it's clearly not a key part of what the Trump administration cares about. And instead thinking about how is it that the Trump administration utilizes social media, for instance, to be able to get what they want, and seeing that sort of shift taking place. And then in the intro class, for me, it's a lot of, well, what are we seeing people writing about right now that I can tie into what it is that we're teaching? So, for instance, I just got done with a section on anarchy in international relations, the idea that there is no, hierarchical government that controls how the world functions. And I supplemented that with an article by Dan Dresner and Elizabeth Saunders that came out just a couple of weeks ago about how Trump and anarchy have been different than what we've seen with anarchy going back to the post-World War II era, as Tim mentioned earlier. So those are just some kind of starting points for me, at least.
Yeah, so I teach a course called U.S. and the World, and I have had a very similar experience on thinking, well, what do I take out of this course and what do I add to it? And as Tim mentioned, I have had, for 20 years, I've been working on an introductory textbook in the field. And 2 weeks ago, Kim and I were sitting down and thinking about, okay, for a fourth edition, what would we change? And we were looking at entire chapters that we were wondering, do we still have a chapter on development, with the abolition or dismantlement of U.S. aid, with all the funding drying up? Oh, sorry, is this better there?
Tilt it, just right into the end. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Yay, thank you very much. Yeah, so with the dismantlement of U.S. aid, should we even be kind of encouraging students to think about this as a career option? How important is this going to be kind of as an idea? Do we shift to focusing on global poverty? And what I would say is, something's very interesting is happening. So I teach in the International Studies program, which is within the Department of Politics and Global Affairs. And our enrollment has been in decline for some time at PSU for a lot of big factors. Right now, students are flocking to our classes. It's interesting. And I think it's because people really want to understand the fundamentals of how the system basically works on a global level. What is NATO? What's the World Bank? How is this sort of supposed to function? I think there's a real curiosity. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in my classes is go back to the fundamentals, to talk about the Bretton Woods structure. How did the U.S. create a global architecture in 45, 46? How was that constructed, and what was the basic concept behind that? And then the other thing I try to talk about a little bit, and I'm thinking about this quite a bit, is the idea of the loss of faith, because I feel that what we're seeing right now is deeper than just one political leader, and it's deeper even than the kind of U.S. perspective on foreign affairs. It's more than that. It's a broader loss of faith, I would say, in kind of the classical liberal ideals that underlay so much of our political system and the world order since 45. And so it's not just the international order. It's people have lost faith in academia. They've lost faith in expertise. So it's a broader construct. And so one of the things I want to do, as funny as it sounds, is go back to theory. And so that we can first talk about what was the ideology behind this and what might be changing that now.
Well, so as it's changing, are you aware of it being sort of like teaching history? Are you teaching a boutique concept that continue to fuels academe, or are you looking at theories that are actually out in the world running around with legs and are still giving us the metaphor, the operating system that we need? Matt, you brought up the question of grand strategy.
Yeah. So before I get to grand strategy, the point about history, I think, is a really, really interesting one, because teaching U.S. foreign policy in particular for me is increasingly feeling like a history class, where this is the way that things used to be done, and we're still trying to figure out how things are going right now. So, you know, I'm teaching about this concept. This is the way it has been. I want you to understand that. And then talking about what's going on right now. So there's a tension there for certain. But yeah, so one thing that I teach in my foreign policy class is just a section on grand strategy. And I've been doing that since I started teaching at Lewis and Clark, which was in 2020. And from the very beginning, I've always had a segment in there that is about Trump's grand strategy. What is it? What does it look like? Does he have one? And that's not meant to be derogatory, not to say like, oh, he's an idiot and doesn't have a grand strategy. That's not the argument at all. In fact, it's that, you know, not having a grand strategy can be a good thing, that it can give you more flexibility, it can give you the ability to respond more easily as opposed to having a particular framework in mind that says, this is the way that I have to act. But one of those readings is about, by Barry Posen, makes the argument that Trump's approach to grand strategy is trying to think about international order, yes, but from an illiberal international order. And further, he argues that it's more continuity in foreign policy than we might think. And that's something that we have to grapple with as scholars, as citizens, about how much of Trump is in fact truly a breakaway from what has been in the past, and how much of it is more similar than we might want to admit, I guess we might say. That's especially the case in the first Trump term. In the second Trump term, I think we're seeing a little bit more divergence. But nonetheless, trying to at least ask that question of how much of this is continuity, how much of this is truly divergent, I think is a core question that we have to kind of think through.
So let me ask you this. How have you seen the engagement with students change between 2020 and now? And the students you said who were flocking to the classroom, what are the questions that they're bringing with them? What is their understanding? I think you said that you're not seeing people checking the boxes so clearly of being right or being left. Have they also been, disillusioned with expertise and institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that comes through very clearly. And what I would say with my students, so I teach this course, The U.S. and the World, and the reason it has that title is it's about U.S. foreign policy, but it's also supposed to be how the U.S. is perceived and thought about globally. And we cover major world regions, we cover major theories, and it's interesting. So the average age for a student at PSU is 28 to 30. And so you get a real divergence of views. And what I notice is that there's a common sense of disillusionment, I would say, but people are disillusioned for different reasons. So you have people who are 30, 35, 40 maybe, and they're disillusioned with globalization. They've heard the argument that, overall a rising tide raises all boats. They've got a brother in the Midwest who's maybe their manufacturing job is gone, and they just feel like, a lot of them, that the system isn't working so well. So I think for that group, it's about, we were promised some things and we're not getting them. And that's combined with war fatigue and inequality, affordability, and that's created a real sense of disillusionment. The 18-year-olds have a very different perspective in that the older group, I would say, feels like this isn't working for us, and the younger group kind of feels like, in general, why was the system supposed to work at all? Like, how was this ever legitimate? Like, we're talking about promoting democracy. Seems like we're awful selective about that. And this is a group that 2008 is a key memory for them. If I was to have some of my students here, they'd start talking about how the bankers were not accountable, but people who owned a mortgage would. And they just, at a fundamental sense, I think, have a sense that the system is less legitimate. And I want to tell one story real quickly, because you asked about, well, if we talk about theory, is this kind of a boutique thing that's kind of sort of separated from the world? And I had just started teaching. This was in the 90s, and there was a big set of protests that were happening up in Seattle. And I was teaching this introductory course, And I came into my office, and it's when you still use that phone with the flashing light, and there was a message, and I picked it up, and I knew some of my students had gone up to Seattle to protest, and people were dressing up as sea turtles at this protest. And so there was a message from a student: yeah, I got arrested today. I'm still being held here. I'm not going to be able to make class on Monday. You know, I'm up here and I'm protesting against them giving out all this money to all these poor countries, and then they can't repay it. And I'm thinking two things. A, if you've got one phone call, don't call me to tell me you're going to not make class. But the other thing is, you've got the World Trade Organization, the World Bank mixed up. So if you're going to go to jail protesting, you should know what it is you're protesting against. So I do feel like this understanding of both theory, the idea of why we want things this way, and then also what are these organizations is really fundamental.
And also, I think what theories we're interested in now. One of the things that we talked about very briefly was, we're starting to have a lot more discussion of ideas that are, I think, not easily fitting into the sorts of theories that we usually teach in an IR course. So, for instance, I was just looking through on my social media feed. There was an article by Adam Serwer, I believe, at The Atlantic about the Trump administration being neo-conservatism, that their goal is to try and impose authoritarian ethno-nationalist states. Or we talked about neo-royalism being the primary motivation of the Trump administration, trying to enrich themselves first and foremost. And those are not things that neatly fit into what we've historically, I think, taught in intro classes for international relations about realism and liberalism and constructivism. So I think at least for me, having to kind of broaden my thinking and try and incorporate newer ideas in that way has been a challenge as well.
So one of the other things that I think has come up, and I think the essay in the book points at this, was, we were looking at rules, a commitment to institutions and rules. We're looking at security cooperation. We're looking at open and rules-based economy. We're looking at, a commitment to democratic solidarity. But there was this sort of unspoken idea of moral leadership. And should moral leadership still be a defining feature of U.S. foreign policy? And I was joking to Matt earlier. I heard someone say this the other day of African leaders saying, when the Americans come to us, they give us a lecture. When the Chinese come to us, they give us a bridge. But so it feels like in this evolving sphere of influence, to use another term, we're seeing the moral leadership taking a back seat to a far more mercantilist or transactional approach. Is that correct? Where do you?
Yes, I think that's fair, to put it shortly. Again, one concept that I think goes back a long way is the idea of hypocrisy is built into the liberal international order from the very get-go, right? That that in a lot of ways the order serves to bind the United States, but not always. And that's especially true in the case of like sovereignty, the idea that states are free to do whatever it is that they want, more or less, within their own borders. But the U.S. is clearly not abided by that and interferes quite consistently. So I think that in some ways, again, asking about this question of like continuity or divergence, this seems to be more the Trump administration just sort of saying, we're not even going to pretend like we're, abiding by any of these rules or anything along these lines, and we're just going to do what we want because, well, we can. And even begin to come back to the neo conservatism, where for the neocons, the idea that the U.S. had the moral right, not right, the responsibility to intervene in other countries to make the world a better place. Now we see, the U.S. has the right and the power to intervene, but not necessarily for those moral reasons or justifications.
Well, can we jump back to, because we're hearing the word, and we've heard it so many, I think every single week of this series. Let's talk about spheres of influence for a minute. And I'm thinking of Stephen. Do any of you know Stephen Walt? Just put your hand up. I know Lance does. But he wrote an article this week in Foreign Affairs on the U.S. as a predatory hegemon. And thinking about, and then today has a piece in Foreign Policy about spheres of influence and how is it understood, how is it misunderstood, and you brought up the question of anarchy. And he says spheres of influence is both an inevitable result of international anarchy and an imperfect solution to the competitive incentives that anarchy creates. And is this notion of spheres of influence, I mean, just look at everything that has happened since the new year, Venezuela, Iran, is this coming into conversation in your classrooms more? And is it shifting how you're talking about international rules?
I think this comes back to something that Matt said earlier, that there are continuities here. It's not all a rupture, but it's continuities that go back before 1945. So my background is as a historian. And of course, when you see what's happening in, say, Venezuela, it feels very familiar in a way. This was the U.S. approach to Latin America between, say, the 1870s and mid-1935. And the U.S. would prop up a whole series of authoritarian dictators like Antonio Somoza in Nicaragua. And, I don't know if it's actually true, but apparently the apocryphal saying, at least, was that Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, yeah, he's a bastard, but he's our bastard. It was very much a transactional sort of approach in which you put in leaders who are associated, say, with the United Fruit Company in Central America and advance U.S. business interests. And so I do think that kind of, in some ways, Trump isn't entirely a rupture, but it's a rupture from 1945 on. And I do absolutely agree that it's a spheres of influence approach. My students talk about that a lot. My students, they firmly believe that, Trump's approach to Ukraine has been shaped by his own interest in Canada and Greenland. So that's very much part of their perspective. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, even if you read the National Security Strategy document that was published back in, late November, I believe it was, you see that exact same sort of logic. It isn't necessarily the words spheres of influence coming across, but it's very clear that the Trump administration is buying into that idea and propagating that idea that there's certain parts of the world that we have the right to interfere with, and we're going to do that where we think it's in our best interest. And, Russia has their kind of own area, and we're just sort of going to leave them alone, right? So, yes, I think that the notion of spheres of influence, it's prominent. I don't know that students necessarily pick up on it, at least in my cases, to the same extent. But, once you start kind of digging a little bit into some of that documentation and start seeing the way that the administration is writing about these things and obviously the way they're acting, I think, yeah, that's a very easy takeaway to have.
So Eikenberry, in the chapter in the book, he really frames the argument as, a fundamental choice between liberal internationalism and America First, but are they mutually exclusive, and is there a middle ground between the two?
I would argue that historically speaking, the liberal international order has been America First. I mean, just if we think back to, post-World War II Europe and the idea of empire by invitation was the argument. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but that the Europeans invited the United States in to help rebuild, and in so doing, start kind of the foundations of what we would, in a lot of cases, think of as an empire. I don't think that there's just there's the America First approach and then there's the liberal international order approach. I think that there is absolutely a lot of America First just that's inherently built into the liberal international order. And the Trump administration, I think, either doesn't understand or doesn't accept the ways in which it is America First, and instead tries to seek out the more transactional approach that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I mean, if you look at American power from 1945 on, a lot of it was built on three things: alliances, rules, and international organizations. And there were international organizations that the U.S. largely helped to create. There were rules that the U.S. helped to draft, and alliances that were really fundamental to American power. For example, if you think now about where we were with the rise of China, and if you're worried about a conflict over Taiwan, it's one thing for the U.S. to have that conflict if, say, Japan, Australia, India, and other major countries are allies, and another if it's faced with that same situation without those alliances. It's a fundamentally different situation. And I think that the Trump administration now really looks at alliances as a burden. Why are we paying so much for NATO in terms of our military, and why aren't other countries doing so much? But you know, I think alliances are a little bit like insurance. You're paying to deter up front. It's a lot cheaper than a war. And I don't think that fundamentally there's that sense. And if you look at that entire system of alliances, there's no other country that has a network of military bases like the U.S. It's foundational to America's military power. So it's not something that the U.S. has created out of a sense of altruism.
So one of the things that comes out in this article is the retreat from promoting democracy and human rights abroad, and certainly the humanitarian aid perspective. How are you discussing this in your classrooms, and how are students reacting to this? I mean, is there a sense of agency, and or are people feeling at a loss for how to be engaged with something that is happening around them?
So in my introductory class in particular, I teach an article by Suparna Chaudhry at Lewis and Clark College about, it's partly about democratic backsliding, but really it's about the ways that states have learned how to deal with quote-unquote threats internally without just using violence. So she talks about how, historically speaking, a lot of states have used violent crackdown if there's an organization, an NGO that they don't like. But now we're seeing the propagation of administrative crackdown being used. So passing laws, passing rules to try and make it so that it's more difficult for these organizations to be able to function in the first place. But because it's administrative, it's not violent, it doesn't get the same sort of backlash from the rest of the world. So it's a much more, I don't want to say strategic because that implies that violence is not strategic, but it's just a new and different approach that gets utilized along with violence to try and bring about these changes. And I think we're seeing the United States moving down that same road, right? And this is, you know, it's easy to say like that this is a problem of authoritarian regimes doing these things, but it's not just that. There are lots of democracies around the world that have been doing this exact same thing. So if anything, for me, that kind of makes me think, you know, we need to be more aware and we need to be thinking very carefully about what are the things that should be done in the U.S. to prevent that sort of backsliding from taking place.
Jim, something you want to add?
Yeah, there's a bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, when the world's wealthiest democracy kind of steps back from the international arena and starts to use a very, very different kind of, I would call it ethno-nationalist sort of rhetoric, it does empower all kinds of different voices globally that might not have been heard in the same way. At the same time, what my students certainly emphasize the fact that the U.S. has been very selective in its democracy promotion. And one of the things that I think has changed that's really got to be talked about when you look at U.S. foreign policy right now is the extent of war fatigue. Because you had, of course, Vietnam, then you had Iraq. You know, the American people were told that there was a rationale for Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction were not found. Then you had Afghanistan. And for many of my students who are, you know, 18, 19, that's just a fundamental experience of watching those scenes of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so I think that kind of feeds into this sense of disillusionment that, we're continually going to war, we spend trillions of dollars, what do we get out of it, who's benefited, and why do we trust the elites that are saying we should go to war? And so my students have kind of a fairly cynical, often, take on the history of U.S. foreign policy, where they're not really convinced that it was ever fundamentally about democracy in any case. So there's a contradiction there.
Well, we talked about this the other day in the many years that I've been at WorldOregon, we've had a lot of interns from both Lewis and Clark and PSU over the years. And early on, a lot of the students were doing study abroad. They were learning Arabic. There was a big period where I saw a lot of students interested in foreign service and being able to be engaged in the world in that way. I saw that shifting, I would say around 2008, or no, maybe 2012, 2013, more toward people working for international development or NGOs. And now I'm curious, and we talked a little bit about this, where do you see, what are students wanting to do with an international affairs degree? And do they want a life of service? Do they understand the importance of diplomacy and why soft power over social media actually does play a role? Where are they going with learning about the world?
It's funny. So we wrote this textbook, and I have to say one really brief story. We had got Cambridge University Press had given us a contract, and they sent it out for peer review, and these external reviewers really liked it, and we thought, well, how thoughtful of them, what wonderful comments, we're feeling pretty good. So we made the changes, sent it back to Cambridge University Press. They sent it out to an entirely new group of reviewers, and they hated it. Like, you have never seen such scathing reviews. I actually threw that out a few years ago, and it felt like taking a weight off my shoulder. And then we were like, well, what do we do now? And so we went to the University of North Carolina Press that had published some of my earlier books, and they sent it out, and we're all just like kind of this sick feeling like, we've worked on this for years. Is it ever going to see the light of day? And the reviewers came back, and they really liked it. And I was like, except for the last chapter. That was the one thing that they thought had to come out, and it was called Where Do We Go Now? Careers in the Field. And Kim and I had kind of this moment of, what do we do? Because this is really fundamental to what we think students should know, and yet if we do this one thing, they're saying they'll take it. And we stuck to our guns, and the press stuck with us, and it came out. And every time I have talked to students since then who've been reading the book, they always thank us for including that chapter. And it seems sort of obvious that you would have that chapter, but there was a sense 10, 15 years ago in academia, we don't want to kind of sully our hands by talking about careers too much. So I think this is absolutely fundamental. I would say that since 2008, students have become more interested in business options. I think students are very concerned about development as an option. I have one of my students who worked for the Department of Commerce, and basically her job was export-import controls of certain metals that are used when you're creating a nuclear weapon. And I don't really understand it, but she had her boss come to her at 5 o'clock in January and say that she had to leave the building and she'd be escorted to the door. And she just got an email that they're hiring her back, actually. But students know these stories. And so what's interesting to me is every year I write 15 to 30 recommendations to graduate programs for students. I have not done one this year for the United States. Every single one has been abroad.
I would say, from my experience, generally speaking, law school still seems to be something that students are generally interested in. There has been some tension in there, at least insofar as talking to those students when they're taking, say, the constitutional law class. It's like, well, is the Constitution just sort of what the Roberts Court says that it is, in which case, what are we learning? and how can we apply that when it comes to law school, which has been a major sticking point for a lot of students, for those that are thinking about law school. But I actually ran into one of my former students yesterday, and he was saying, yeah, I want to try and like do something, right? I want to try and make some sort of change in the world. So I'm thinking about either law school or going to graduate school, and just trying to figure out what would be like the best avenue for being able to try and enact some sort of change. And we had a long conversation about what the kind of pros and cons of each of those options were. But it was very interesting to hear him talk about grad school in that sort of optimistic manner. I was frankly kind of surprised that he saw that as a viable avenue for being able to bring about change. That's just typically not the way that I think of the way I think students approach it right now. So yeah, it gives me some sort of optimism, at least. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be trying to go to grad school here in the U.S. or go elsewhere, or what his ultimate decision is. But yeah.
Well, for us, the World Oregon, we're part of a network, I think you all know this, of 90 plus World Affairs Councils around the country, and we are really part and parcel of the birth of institutions that came into being. Many of us were prior to World War II, but definitely from the 50s onward, we were developed as organs of community engagement around issues of what does it mean to be a global citizen. And when we look at education, we think about nurturing a generation of diplomats, whether that means in an official capacity with the U.S. government, or in looking at ways in which we develop mutual understanding, whether that be through trade or through art and culture or any number of different things. And many of you probably know that Derek Olson, our president, was a Foreign Service officer. And I think we're all somewhat worried about the people who have walked away from these careers and whether we will see a new generation that is authentically committed to this idea that global connection, peace and prosperity will happen when we learn how to listen and talk to one another. So do you build questions of diplomacy and soft power and mutual understanding into these programs and these classes?
Well, so I already covered soft power, so I'm not going to go back to that. But questions of like diplomacy and sort of like how does that actually function, I guess? Yes, absolutely. So in the section on grand strategy, I do talk to my students about sort of like what does the process look like of how diplomacy actually functions? What does that look like? Who are the actors involved? I have a section in the class that's about the federal bureaucracy and how it is that influences foreign policy. Because I think it is important for students to be aware of and to think about how these things that we don't necessarily think about as being like, at the foremost, like most influential or most exciting things, they matter immensely. And that's kind of one of the reasons why it is sad to hear about, the Foreign Service being cut back or having people leave, because that's not just a matter of expertise and knowledge that's being lost, but I think there's something also about having that kind of more, I don't want to say grounded per se, but like those sorts of opinions being directly involved in the process, I think is very important.
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges is that we've tried for so long to get students to have experience abroad by a series of different means. And there were all kinds of different funding opportunities, not just for students, but also from faculty. Everything from Boren scholarships for students to Fulbrights. And a lot of these things are either entirely gone at this moment or they're being scaled back and changed. And so I think it's a really difficult challenge for us because we do want to talk to students about pathways. We do want to get them excited about diplomacy. We do want to kind of give them options where they can explore different things. Right now, everything's so much in flux. I personally I sometimes I think, oh, I should really tell the students about this opportunity, and then I have to go Google it. Does it still exist anymore? So it's everything's in flux so much. It's very hard.
Well, it's really hard when we've shifted from a material economy to a knowledge economy, and I've been a little obsessed lately with this notion of the attention economy. And we hear about this a lot because there was an article earlier this week about are we in a clicktatorship, where we're seeing a barrage of information, and the notion of the attention economy is, it is commerce, it is news, it is PR, it is everything sort of folding in on itself, and at the same time sort of dissolving the news and the noise. And so I guess I don't know where we go with that, because I hate to believe that social media is replacing soft power. I think that there are very, very good reasons for having good neighbor policies. But I'd love to, Derek, if you could, Derek's going to have a mic. I'd love to open this up to a conversation with all of you on what you're thinking, where you think we could be going, and some thoughts for our speakers.
Thank you for all your good comments and thoughts. Slightly different tact in terms of, is there any hope for the Congress? The article, and it's been a tradition in U.S. foreign policy that bipartisanship has been key to advancing the agenda. My personal experience was with international trade, WTO, from mid-'80s on. So I saw some progressive, quote unquote, bipartisanship move a trade agenda forward. Another discussion on what the result was. But there are any number of Congress people who have served in the military with experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, disastrous foreign policy issues. On the Republican side, they are completely prone in terms of what's happening with the executive branch. And I'm just wondering if there's any analysis that you're aware of that sees any hope. Thank you. No could be fine too.
I think I'll just start to say that I think right now in our current political climate, if you're focusing on bipartisanship, which I think you mentioned, that I don't see a bipartisan foreign policy consensus emerging anytime soon. But you also asked about kind of, I think, Congress and its role. I think we'll know better in about November or so. But Matt, I'm curious what you think about that.
Historically speaking, the executive has been given a lot of deference when it comes to foreign policy. And Congress has, in some cases willingly, in some cases less willingly, given up a lot of that power, right? Whether we think about, attempts to claw back influence through the War Powers Act, or on the flip side, using statutory authority to give power to the executive over, say, the use of economic sanctions and things along those lines. Generally speaking, of Congress itself, I'm not super optimistic. But I think that the route to making Congress act is through pressure from the public, frankly. I think that's where we're seeing more success of constituents going and yelling at their members of Congress and telling them, you're being too lax, you're being too agreeable, you gotta push. This is the time. So if anything is successful, I think that's really the avenue by which Congress will be more active and more influential. Because generally speaking, again, historically, if you want to know when oversight occurs, it's really only when the opposition party holds at least one of the two chambers in Congress. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if it's a Democratic president, Republican president, you don't see oversight. So you got to have one of those at the bare minimum. Like there's a lot of really good research on kind of that pattern of behavior, but yeah, for me, and I'm not somebody who's a big person on like public opinion mattering, if I'm being honest, but I don't think it's about public opinion per se. It's really about pressure points and applying pressure to members of Congress to make change happen.
So a quick follow-up on that. We'll take a question in the front. We were talking about this a lot with the tariffs, but of course the Supreme Court case on the IEPA, the acronym for the law that allegedly will or will not allow tariffs. I mean, presumably that could be a check on executive power more so than Congress at the moment.
If the courts go that route, which, I mean, there's some indication that they will, but again, right now under Trump, there's a great article by Elizabeth Saunders about how we're seeing an imperial presidency both at home and abroad, right, that is not just about Congress, but it's also about the courts. So I think that's certainly a possibility, but again, I'm not optimistic per se.
How should the members of public put pressure on their Congress people? Should they write an email? Should they call the phone number and leave a message at the office of the congressperson? Should they protest just willy-nilly? How should it be done? How can we access them to get that pressure idea that you said?
So the answer is yes. You do all of those things because honestly, different people have different capabilities, right? Like not everybody has the time, ability, energy to go and march in a No Kings protest. More recently with the tear gas protests here in Portland near the ICE facility. Not everybody is willing to accept that risk, and that's perfectly fine. So, to me, I think of the options, that's kind of like the most easily done, but also the one that seems to have the most influence is calling. Emails, like if that's all you can do, great. But like calling and talking to people and leaving messages and letting people know, letting the members of Congress and their staff know just how vehemently you feel about these things is, I think, really, really critical. Because if they're not hearing from you, then they're not going to act. So. Protests, obviously, like when you have a mass protest, that also matters immensely, especially if it's well organized and you can have like the really big numbers of, again, a No Kings sort of thing. But on a day-to-day basis, call every day.
I just say that I completely agree with what you just said.
Thank you very much for your presentation today. I'm wondering if either of you teach a incident of historical similarity to the situation we're involved in at this particular point, and if you do, if you teach any lessons that have been learned or that we might learn from those similar historical events.
Yeah, this is something, as a historian, and I did my doctoral research in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and I was looking at the breakdown of democracy in Latin America and the civil military politics that kind of led to that. And it's funny because I was doing work on authoritarianism until about the early 2000s, and then I actually gave it up because I thought, well, this isn't really so relevant anymore. I want to work on something that's more pertinent. And actually, what I would focus on is less on examples of how democracies have broke down, but examples of where things have worked even when under strain. And I think looking at Brazil is really interesting. I've done a few talks here on Brazil before. Brazil, as we all know, probably had a populist nationalist leader who also very much wanted to contest the authenticity of the election that he lost. And in this case, it was very interesting. The courts shut down a lot of speech. that can't really happen here. But they said, no, you're not able to do this without evidence. You can't say that. And the elites really rallied together. And I think there were multiple points where the system sort of worked in a way that it wouldn't have had a chance to do 20 years before, because people have been kind of preparing for this moment and thinking about it and kind of laying some groundwork to kind of prevent something like this from happening. And so I think it's very interesting that I think Bolsonaro was very much inspired by Trump. I think Brazil is the country in Latin America that is both like most like the United States, its size, its legacies of slavery, issues of inequality. There are a lot of similarities there. And so I think it's interesting to look at Brazil very recently and see what went right.
I would only add, just very broadly, that I think this is a great area where comparative political scientists are incredibly valuable. In the field of political science, generally speaking, you have Americanists, comparativists, IR people, and political theory. And it has stuck in my craw for a long time that Americanist and comparative politics people haven't been having the sorts of conversations that we need to be having about what is it that we can learn from other countries, because, America, it's not special or unique from everybody else. And the idea that we can't learn lessons from other countries, I think, is something that it bothers me immensely that for a long, long time they've just been siloed off in different things. I think we're seeing a lot more of that conversation now. There's a lot of really good work done by some of the scholars on competitive authoritarianism and democratic backsliding in comparative politics that has been making its way into discussions of American politics. But I think that that's something that we need more of.
I was wondering, this sort of denunciation of hypocrisy that you're talking about with your students, hypocrisy has a use. At least you're looking at values and you're saying you're not meeting them. So when you become more nihilist, you undermine that. But let me ask you this question from somebody who spent 30 years.
Flip the switch, then ask your question. There you go.
I don't know, is it up? Hello? Is it going? Hello? Okay, somebody who worked 30 years in the international area, there's a whole group of careers that you're not talking about, which essentially was in the post-Vietnam era. There was a lot of disillusionment, especially with Watergate and everything. And what people did is they built alternative institutions that did work, and they were private institutions. They did Track 2 work. They did human rights work. They did all kinds of connection work and everything, including the WTO demonstrations, which I'd be happy to talk to you about. And put pressure on that way politically. Do you tell your students about those kinds of opportunities?
Absolutely, yes. There's lots of non-governmental organizations that exist out there that are incredibly valuable, and that those are careers that people should be very, very happy to have. I've talked to students about both local NGOs and ones that are more like, nationwide or what have you as options, certainly.
But they can build them. What I'm saying is if there's a need, you can be entrepreneurial, and that's what happened in the 70s and 80s. There were a whole series of institutions built, like Human Rights Watch, which was originally Helsinki Watch. Just a whole series.
I actually wanted to kind of come back to the first part of what you were talking about, the fact that there's, even if there's hypocrisy, having a set of values that you clearly hold to is still something that's meaningful. And I'm guessing that some of you saw, I'm both a U.S. citizen and a Canadian citizen, so I tend to follow Canadian politics. And some of you may have seen Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos. What a speech, right? And this is something that he explicitly talked about, that there was always this awareness that there was this kind of distance between what the reality was and what people were saying, but you know what? Everybody sort of was willing to go along as certain other needs are met. And I do think that, yeah, it was imperfect, but it also, there were certain boundaries that were set there that you could go so far, but you couldn't go too much farther. So I agree with you. There was still value in that, and that has broken down. And you don't hear a lot of speech right now about kind of a value-based order in the same way, although there certainly is reference to what I would call kind of ethno-nationalist kind of discourse, which I guess is also has a set of values to it.
So we are at time. This is an incredible opportunity. I always love using the metaphor of choose your own adventure, and we are at a juncture. You know, we all know the metaphor of the carrot and the stick. You know, you can still put an eye out with a carrot, just to remind you of that. But these sort of conversations are so vital. As a reminder, you know, WorldOregon, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational organization, and it is so important to support the expression and the discussion of these types of ideas, whether we agree with them or whether we don't agree with them. And this is what shapes informed discourse. It's what teaches us to speak and agree and disagree with each other with grace, and hopefully, you know, a little bit more information. And so I'm just always grateful for all the questions, all of the insight, and speakers who are willing to sit down with us and reflect on what is important to them personally, institutionally, as educators. And thank you very, very much. And thank you to both Matt and Shawn.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And please join us next week. We will have Sam Kaplan, who we have had speak for us here before, talking about U.S. and China. And Sam is a fantastic thinker, and he won't use math. So I encourage you all to bring friends, and have a great week, and we will see you soon.